Grandmother's handwriting looked exactly the same as it always had. Careful, deliberate. Every letter formed like she had all the time in the world. That was the part that broke me. Standing in my aunt's living room in Oakville with a document in my hands that said I had been removed from the family trust. I didn't cry. I didn't say anything. I just stood there reading it a second time, then a third, while everyone around me pretended to be busy with their plates of food. It was the Saturday after Grandma Helene's funeral, the kind of grey November afternoon that feels like the sky is pressing down on everything. My aunt had organized a small gathering at her house, close family only, she'd said. I drove from Toronto by myself. My husband had offered to come, but I told him I was fine. I wasn't fine. I just didn't want to witness. There were maybe 12 of us. My aunt, my uncle, my two cousins and their families, a few of Grandma's friends from her church in Burlington. My mother wasn't there. She passed away 4 years ago from a stroke, which is the only reason any of what happened next was even possible. My grandmother raised me for most of my childhood. My mother struggled, I won't go into all of it. And from the time I was 9 until I left for university, I lived in Grandma Helene's house on a quiet street in Hamilton. She taught me how to make pierogies. She drove me to swim practice at 6 in the morning, 3 days a week for 7 years. When I got into Queens for engineering, she cried harder than I did. She told me more than once that the house would be mine someday. Not as a transaction, just as a fact, the way she talked about the weather or what was planted in the garden. You want to repaint the kitchen eventually, she said to me once. That yellow is starting to look dated. I was 22. I nodded and stored it away. My aunt poured wine and made small talk, and at some point her husband, a man I have never once had a genuine conversation with in 15 years of family events, handed me an envelope and said the lawyer had asked for me to have it at the gathering. I thought it was a letter, something personal Grandma had written before she got sick. She had been diagnosed with early stage dementia 14 months before she died. And in the months before that, while she was still sharp, she had been writing things down. Letters, lists, instructions. She told me once she was getting her paperwork in order. I thought that was what this was. It was a copy of a trust amendment. Dated 8 months ago, my name had been removed. The house, a portfolio of GICs totaling somewhere around $400,000, and a piece of land in Prince Edward County that Grandma had owned since the 70s, all of it redirected to my aunt and to my cousin Whitmore. Whitmore, who I had spoken to maybe 6 times in the last decade. Whitmore, who had moved to Calgary and never came back, not even when my grandmother had her first fall, not even when she was in the hospital in February. Whitmore, whose wedding gift to my grandmother, a framed print she never once hung on the wall, was still leaning against the baseboard in the spare bedroom. I read the document twice. I set it down on the coffee table. I picked up my glass of wine and I said nothing. My aunt was watching me. She had been watching me since I arrived, in that particular way people watch you when they're waiting for a reaction. Not out of guilt, out of curiosity. The lawyer will be in touch, she said. There's no dispute. It was all done properly. I nodded. I said, thank you for letting me know. And then I went to use the washroom, sat on the edge of the bathtub, and texted my husband 2 words, come get me. I want to explain something about my grandmother's dementia, because it matters. It wasn't the kind you see in movies where someone forgets who they are. In the early stages, for her, it came and went. She'd have a clear week and then a foggy afternoon. She could talk about her childhood in vivid detail and then lose track of what she'd had for breakfast. The doctors called it mild cognitive impairment with some fluctuation. What that meant in practice was that she was sometimes herself and sometimes not quite herself, and that the difference wasn't always obvious from the outside. My aunt had power of attorney. She got it 18 months before Grandma died, which was reasonable. Someone needed to manage the finances when things got complicated. I didn't fight it. I had a full-time job in Toronto, a mortgage, a life. My aunt lived 20 minutes from my grandmother. It made sense. What I didn't know until later was how that power of attorney had been used. I didn't do anything for about 3 weeks after the gathering. I drove home with my husband. I told him what had happened, and I spent most of that weekend sitting on our couch in my sweater, staring at the middle distance while he made soup and didn't push me to talk. He's a patient person. I am lucky in that. Then I called a lawyer. Not an estate lawyer specifically, I didn't know yet what I was dealing with. Just a general practitioner my coworker had used for a real estate dispute. I explained the situation. He listened. He asked one question: when exactly was the amendment signed, and where was my grandmother at that time? I didn't know, so I started finding out. The trust amendment was dated March 14th. That was 8 months before Grandma died. I called her doctor's office, not expecting much, but they were actually helpful once I explained I was a family member involved in an estate matter. They couldn't share full records without proper authorization, but they told me that my grandmother had been admitted to St. Joseph's Healthcare in Hamilton from March 9th to March 18th. She had a fall, a fractured wrist, and some confusion that required monitoring. She was in the hospital when she signed the document. I sat with that for a moment, wrote it down on the notepad I'd been keeping. Then I called the notary whose name appeared on the amendment. He was cautious at first, professional, but I asked him directly, "Do you have records of where this signing took place and who was present?" He said he would need to check his files and that any formal records request would need to go through proper channels. I said that was fine. I said I was prepared to go through proper channels. What I found next was the part that changed everything. Not through the notary, not yet. That took longer. But I had a copy of the amendment my aunt's husband had handed me, and I looked at it carefully, the way I hadn't looked at it carefully at first, because I was in shock. It was a scanned PDF, which meant it was a digital copy of a physical document, which meant it had a creation date embedded in its metadata. I'm an engineer. I know about metadata, not because I work in that field specifically, but because at some point in your technical education you learn that digital files carry information about themselves. When they were created, what software made them, what computer they came from. The PDF had been created on March 12th at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Windows laptop, with the username visible in the document properties. The username was my aunt's husband's name. Let me be precise about what this means, because it matters. This means the document was composed on his computer 3 days after my grandmother was admitted to hospital with a fall and cognitive confusion while she was still inpatient. Someone created this document, or at minimum, someone created the digital version of this document on his laptop while my grandmother was lying in a hospital bed. I sent the metadata screenshot to my lawyer that same night. He called me the next morning. He was no longer a general practitioner in tone. He was very focused and very direct. He gave me the name of an estate litigation lawyer in Toronto who he said was the right person for this. He said, "I think you have something." Her name was Josephine. I don't use her last name out of respect for her ongoing practice. She was calm in the way that very competent people are calm. Not detached, just efficient with her reactions. She looked at everything I had, asked about a dozen clarifying questions, and then said, "The metadata is useful, but it's not sufficient on its own. What we need is evidence of your grandmother's cognitive state on the date the document was signed." That meant medical records. That meant a formal records request, which she filed. It took 6 weeks. The records showed that on March 14th, the date of the signing, my grandmother had been assessed twice by the attending physician. The morning assessment noted disorientation and difficulty with short-term recall. The afternoon assessment, taken at approximately 3 p.m., noted some improvement, but flagged that she was easily confused and fatigued. The notes specifically said she should avoid complex decision-making while recuperating. The signing, according to the notary's records, which we obtained through formal channels, took place at 4:15 p.m. My lawyer set her pen down after reading that. Then she looked at me and said, "This is going to be a conversation. I want to tell you about my aunt because she's not a cartoon villain and this story doesn't make sense if I pretend she is. She is a woman who did a lot for my grandmother in those last 2 years. She drove her to appointments. She managed the medications. She was there on days when I couldn't be, when I was working or dealing with my own life 2 hours away. I know that. I don't dismiss it. But I also know that somewhere along the way, she started thinking of my grandmother's estate as something that was owed to her. For the effort, for the proximity, for the years she'd put in. And when you start thinking of something as owed to you, it changes how you move through the world. It makes certain decisions feel like corrections rather than thefts. She called me once, during all of this, before the formal letters went out. I don't know if someone told her I was looking into things or if she just sensed it. She called to talk about grandma, ostensibly to share a memory, to say she was grieving too. It was a warm call. She was good at warm calls. Halfway through, she said, Grandma wanted things to go a certain way in the end. She told me a lot of things in those last months. I'm just honoring that. I said, I understand. I did not argue. I did not tip my hand. I had been in enough project meetings in my career to know that the moment you show what you know, the other person starts building walls. After she hung up, I wrote down the exact words she had used. I sent them to my lawyer. The formal letter went out 8 weeks after my first meeting with Josephine. It was addressed to my aunt, her husband, and the trustee of the estate. It outlined the concerns, the date of the amendment, the circumstances of the signing, the medical records, the metadata on the document, the cognitive assessment from March 14th. It requested a full accounting of all transactions made under power of attorney for the 18 months it had been in effect. My aunt did not respond personally, her lawyer did. His first letter was dismissive, a lot of language about the validity of the process, the notary's professional obligations, my grandmother's expressed wishes. My lawyer read it and said, they're worried. The full accounting, when it came, was a document I stared at for a long time. Not because I was surprised, I had been mentally preparing, but because seeing numbers on a page makes something real in a way that suspicion doesn't. Over 18 months, approximately $62,000 had been moved from my grandmother's personal accounts. Some of it was legitimate, medical expenses, home modifications, household costs, but a significant portion, around $40,000, had gone to a joint account held by my aunt and her husband. There was also the matter of a car, a 2022 Lexus SUV purchased 11 months before my grandmother died, registered in my aunt's name, paid for from my grandmother's checking account. Josephine added the car to the motion. What followed was 4 months of back and forth that I will spare you in detail because it is mostly procedural and exhausting. There were affidavits. There were requests for further documentation. There was a mediation session in February where I sat across from my aunt in a boardroom in downtown Toronto and did not look at her for most of it. Not because I was angry, but because I was afraid that if I looked at her, I would start crying, and I didn't want to do that in front of her. She had aged, or maybe I just hadn't looked at her clearly in years. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her lawyer did most of the talking. Mine did too. At one point, the mediator asked if there was anything either party wanted to say directly to the other. There was a pause. My aunt looked at me and said, I was there for her. You have to know that. I was there for her every day. I waited a moment before I answered. I said, I know. And she was there for me every day for the 12 years I lived in her house. We both loved her. That doesn't change what happened. My aunt looked at the table. The mediator moved on. The settlement was reached in March. The estate would be redistributed. The house in Hamilton, the one with the kitchen my grandmother thought I'd want to repaint someday, was returned to the estate for proper probate. The GICs would be divided according to an earlier version of the trust, predating the amendment. The land in Prince Edward County came to me. The Lexus was sold and the proceeds returned to the estate. Of the $40,000 that had been transferred to my aunt's joint account, $36,000 was repaid. No criminal charges were filed. My lawyer had explained the threshold early on. Civil and criminal are different standards, and pursuing criminal charges would have been a longer, harder, more uncertain road. I chose the civil route. I don't know if that was the right call. Some days I think it was. Some days I think the right call doesn't exist in a situation like this. My cousin Whitmore called me after the settlement. I hadn't spoken to him through any of it. He hadn't been directly involved. His name had been on the amendment, but he hadn't orchestrated anything, and his lawyer had quietly distanced him from his parents' position about halfway through the process. When he called, he sounded tired. He said, I didn't know what was happening until it was already done. I said, I believe you. He said, I'm sorry. I told him I appreciated that. I meant it. I've been to the house in Hamilton twice since the settlement. The first time was practical. I needed to walk through it with a real estate agent and understand what it would mean to sell versus to keep. The second time was not practical at all. I went on a Sunday afternoon in April by myself. when the light was coming in the way it used to come through the kitchen window in the late afternoon. That particular gold that I have been chasing in every apartment and house I've ever lived in since. I stood in the kitchen for a long time. I looked at the yellow walls. My grandmother was right, it's dated. But I'm going to paint it myself this summer, and I'm going to keep the color. Not because it's practical, because she chose it once when everything was hers to choose, and I am not going to erase that. You can take a lot from someone. You can forge paperwork and move money and construct a version of events that sounds, from the outside, like things just went a certain way. You can do all of that. But you can't take what was already given. Not really. Not the years, not the drives to swim practice, not the pierogies, not the way she said my name when I walked in the door. Like arriving was still a thing worth celebrating, no matter how old I got. I kept the land in Prince Edward County. I'm going up this August. I've never seen it. She bought it in 1974 and held it for 50 years and never told me why. And I think maybe she was holding it for me even before she knew I existed. I think that's the kind of fate she had. There's a version of this story where I walk out of that living room in Oakville, drive back to Toronto, and never look at the document again. Where I tell myself it's too hard, too expensive, too much grief on top of grief. Where I let the people who counted on my exhaustion win because they had done the math on me and decided I would fold. I almost did. For about 3 weeks, I almost did. What stopped me wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that because I think people expect this kind of story to be driven by rage, by wanting to burn something down. It wasn't that. It was something quieter. It was the memory of my grandmother driving me to swim practice in the dark before the sun came up without a complaint, without expecting anything back. That kind of consistency, that's not obligation. That's integrity. That's a person who decided quietly and without fanfare to show up for someone who needed them. And I think at some point I understood that I owed her the same thing. Not revenge. Just honesty. Just the willingness to look clearly at what had happened and not look away. That's the first thing I'd say to anyone in a situation like mine. The clearest thinking you'll ever do is the thinking you do when you decide to stay calm. My aunt and her husband were counting on emotion, on grief making me irrational, on loss making me passive. What they didn't count on was that I would slow down, that I would read the document a third time, that I would think like an engineer instead of an orphan. There are moments in life when what you know, the technical knowledge, the specific competency, the thing you spent years learning, turns out to be exactly what the situation needed. I knew about metadata because of my education. I had never once thought it would matter outside of a professional context. But the world doesn't always announce when it's about to test you. You just have to have built the foundations before the test arrives. The second thing I'd say is this: doing the right thing is often indistinguishable from the outside, from stubbornness. People will tell you to let it go. They'll frame pursuing the truth as being difficult, as making things harder for everyone, as not honoring the dead by stirring things up. That framing is convenient for people who benefited from the wrong. Don't let someone else's comfort be the reason you abandon what you know to be true. And the third thing, the one I keep coming back to, is that this took months. It took money I hadn't budgeted for. It took conversations that left me drained for days. There is no version of standing up for yourself that is easy or tidy or quick. You have to be willing to stay in it when it stops feeling righteous and starts just feeling like work. That's where most people quit. That's exactly where you can't. My grandmother held a piece of land in Prince Edward County for 50 years. She never developed it, never sold it, never explained it. She just held on. I think about that a lot now. Some things you hold because you trust that their time will come. Some things just need someone patient enough to wait. I'm going up there in August. I don't know what I'll find. But she kept it for a reason, and I intend to find out what that was.